The rain had not stopped for 3 days when Elira Voss came into the world, and the old oak tree in the village square split in half from a single bolt of lightning at the exact moment of her first cry. The midwife who delivered her, a woman named Greta who had brought half the village into the world, stepped back from the cradle with a strange look on her face. The baby's left eye was pale as frost, almost silver, while her right eye was a deep, ordinary brown. Greta had never seen anything like it in 40 years of midwifery, and she said so to anyone who would listen. Within a week, the story had grown arms and legs. By the time Elira was a month old, half the village of Hallowmere believed the storm had marked her as something unnatural. Her mother died of fever before Elira turned 2, weakened from the birth and never fully recovering. And this too was added to the growing pile of misfortunes surrounding the strange child with the mismatched eyes. Her father, a quiet farmer named Joran, tried for a few years to raise her alone, but the weight of the village's whispers wore him down. When Elira was 6, he left in the night, taking only a small bag, and leaving her with his mother, an elderly woman named Old Marin, who lived in a cottage at the edge of the forest. Old Marin was not afraid of her granddaughter. She had lived long enough to know that storms came when they wanted to, regardless of who was being born underneath them, and that eyes came in all colors for reasons nobody fully understood. She took Elira in without hesitation, and raised her with patience and warmth, teaching her to read, using an old, worn collection of books that had belonged to Marin's own mother. She also taught her about herbs and remedies, knowledge passed down through generations of women in their family, knowledge that Marin had used quietly for years to help sick neighbors who came to her door after dark, too proud or too embarrassed to be seen seeking help from the supposedly cursed family. Elira grew up in this small world, between the cottage and the forest, rarely venturing into the village itself. When she did go into Hallowmere with her grandmother to trade herbs for flour or thread, she felt the stares before she even saw the faces. Mothers would pull their children closer. Old men would mutter under their breath and make small gestures meant to ward off bad luck. Even the village priest, a man who was supposed to preach kindness, would give her a tight, uncomfortable smile, and nothing more. Despite all this, Elira did not grow up bitter. She grew up curious. The forest became her real home, full of plants she learned to identify, animals she learned to track, and quiet places where she could sit for hours and think without anyone watching her with suspicion. Her grandmother often said that Elira's mind was sharper than any blade in the village, and it was true. By the time she was 12, she had read every book in their small collection at least 3 times. By 14, she had taught herself enough about anatomy and illness from her grandmother's notes that she could often guess what was wrong with a sick animal or person faster than the village's official physician, an aging man named Dr. Hale, who relied more on old superstition than actual medicine. The years passed this way, quietly. Elira helped her grandmother prepare remedies. She studied. She walked the forest paths alone, no longer afraid of anything within the trees, only of the village beyond them. When she turned 19, her grandmother's hands had grown too stiff with age to harvest herbs properly, so Elira took over most of the work herself, becoming the quiet hands behind every poultice and tincture that left their cottage, even though the credit, when there was any credit at all, usually went to her grandmother's name rather than her own. It was in the autumn of that year, when the leaves had turned gold and red and the air had grown crisp with the coming winter, that the world outside Hallowmere finally arrived at their doorstep in a way nobody expected. Duke Alaric Thornfield was traveling through the region on his way to inspect lands recently added to his family's holdings, a journey that should have taken him nowhere near the small, unremarkable village of Hallowmere. But a sudden, hard rain had turned the country roads to mud, and his carriage, moving too quickly along an uneven path, struck a deep rut, and snapped one of its rear axles. The carriage tilted hard, throwing the Duke against the side panel and badly bruising his arm and shoulder. His driver and the 2 guards traveling with him managed to keep the vehicle from tipping completely, but the axle was beyond simple repair, and night was falling fast. One of the guards rode ahead and found Halomir, returning with word that there was a village nearby, though small and poor, with little to offer in the way of proper lodging or medical care. The Duke, in pain and unwilling to spend the night in a broken carriage in the cold rain, agreed to be taken into the village regardless. When they arrived, the innkeeper, flustered and overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of a nobleman at his door, did not know what to do about the Duke's injured arm. The village physician, Dr. Hale, was away tending to a difficult birth on the far side of the village and could not be reached until morning. It was the innkeeper's wife, in a moment of desperation, who suggested sending for the old woman and her granddaughter who lived at the edge of the forest. She knew, as most of the village quietly knew despite their public scorn, that the granddaughter's remedies often worked better than the doctor's. The Duke, exhausted and in pain, did not care who came, as long as someone could ease his suffering. He gave a tired nod, and a boy was sent running through the rain to fetch help. Illyra arrived at the inn just after dark, her cloak soaked through, carrying a small wooden box of supplies she had grabbed without much thought beyond what might be useful for a broken bone or a bad bruise. She did not know who she was being asked to help. The innkeeper simply said a traveler had been hurt, and that was enough for her. She had treated strangers before, men and women passing through who had nowhere else to turn, and she approached this the same way she approached everything else, with calm focus and quiet confidence. When she stepped into the room and saw the man sitting on the edge of the bed, dressed in fine clothes that even soaked with rain and torn at the shoulder, were clearly expensive, she paused for only a moment. The Duke, for his part, looked at her with open skepticism. He had expected the village doctor, or, at worst, some elderly midwife. Instead, he found a young woman with one pale eye and one brown eye, looking at him with the same steady calm she might have shown anyone else. "Let me see your arm," she said, setting down her box and not waiting for permission. The Duke, too tired and too sore to argue, allowed her to examine him. Her fingers moved carefully along his shoulder and arm, pressing gently in places, asking him to move his fingers, his wrist, his elbow. Within minutes, she had determined that nothing was broken, only badly bruised and strained, and that with proper care, it would heal within 2 weeks without lasting damage. She prepared a poultice from her box, explaining as she worked that it would reduce the swelling and ease the pain, and wrapped his arm with practiced hands. The Duke watched her the entire time, his initial skepticism slowly turning into something closer to curiosity. He asked her how she had learned such things, and she answered honestly, telling him of her grandmother's knowledge and her own years of study. He asked about the books she had read, and was surprised to find she could speak knowledgeably, not only about herbs and healing, but about subjects far beyond what he expected from a village girl, including matters of trade, history, and even some philosophy she had absorbed from her grandmother's old, worn texts. By the time she finished, the rain outside had grown heavier, and the Duke's guard returned with the news that the carriage could not be repaired until at least midday tomorrow, when a proper wheelwright could be found in a larger town 2 hours away. The Duke, his arm now wrapped and the pain considerably eased, found himself with little choice but to remain in Halomir for at least another day. He spent that extra day, and then another after that, when a second problem with the carriage wheel was discovered, observing the village and its strange treatment of the young woman who had helped him. He noticed how people lowered their voices when she passed. He noticed the careful distance everyone kept from her, even as he learned, through quiet conversations with the innkeeper and a few curious questions to passing villagers, that nearly every family in Hallowmere had at some point relied on her grandmother's remedies, and increasingly on Alira's own skill, even while publicly speaking of the family with suspicion and unease. He found this contradiction troubling. A village that quietly depended on a young woman's knowledge, while openly treating her as something to be feared, struck him as both unfair and foolish. He had grown up around enough flattery and false kindness in noble circles to recognize genuine talent when he saw it, and Alira's quiet competence stood out sharply against the backdrop of superstition surrounding her. On the second day, while his carriage was still being repaired, he walked to the edge of the forest and found the cottage where Alira lived with her grandmother. He told himself he was simply checking on his healing arm, but in truth, he was curious to see more of how she lived and worked. Old Marin welcomed him politely, if cautiously, clearly unused to receiving nobility at her door. Alira, busy grinding herbs at a wooden table near the window, looked up with mild surprise but no particular alarm. They spoke for over an hour that afternoon. The Duke asked about her life, her studies, her thoughts on the way the village treated her. She answered plainly, without self-pity, explaining that she had grown used to the whispers and no longer let them trouble her deeply. She spoke of her grandmother with clear affection, of the forest with quiet love, and of her studies with genuine passion. The Duke found himself impressed not only by what she knew, but by how she carried herself despite years of unfair treatment. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a steady, unshaken sense of who she was. That evening, fate intervened once more. A fever began spreading through Hallowmere, starting with 2 children in a family near the village well, and quickly moving to several other households. Dr. Hale, still recovering from his own exhaustion after the earlier difficult birth, found himself overwhelmed within a single day as more and more villagers fell ill with high temperatures, chills, and weakness. Panic began to spread nearly as fast as the fever itself, and Dr. Hale, fearing the illness might be something serious and contagious, packed a bag and left the village entirely, claiming he needed to consult with physicians in a larger town, though most understood this for what it really was, an act of fear disguised as professional caution. With the village's only doctor gone, fear deepened. Families did not know what to do for their sick children and elderly relatives. It was in this moment of crisis that the village's quiet dependence on Alira finally became open and undeniable. One by one, then in greater numbers, villagers who had once crossed the street to avoid her now came to her door. Desperate for help they no longer cared to pretend they didn't need. Alira did not hesitate, despite years of unkindness from these very people. She gathered her supplies, consulted with her grandmother on the best remedies for the symptoms being described, and began moving from house to house, treating the sick with cooling herbs, careful nursing, and the same calm confidence she brought to everything she did. The Duke, rather than continuing on his journey once his carriage was finally repaired, made the unexpected decision to stay and help. He sent his guards to assist with carrying supplies and water, and he himself worked alongside Alira, learning quickly how to prepare simple remedies and how to comfort frightened children and worried parents. For 3 days and nights, Alira barely slept, moving from one home to another, checking on patients, adjusting treatments, and reassuring frightened families. The Duke stayed by her side for much of it, increasingly amazed by her endurance and her clear, careful thinking, even under enormous pressure. He watched her calm a screaming, feverish child with nothing more than a steady voice and gentle hands. He watched her correctly predict which patients would recover quickly and which needed closer attention, judgments that proved accurate again and again. He watched an entire village, people who had spent her whole life treating her as something to be feared, now looked to her as their only hope. By the fourth day, the worst of the fever had passed. No one in the village had died, a fact that villagers quietly attributed to luck, but that the Duke knew, without doubt, was due to Alira's skill and tireless effort. The family she had helped did not suddenly become warm and welcoming. Old habits of suspicion did not disappear overnight, but something had shifted. There were quiet nods of thanks now, where before there had been only fearful glances. A few of the village mothers even brought her gifts of food, embarrassed but sincere in their gratitude. The Duke, watching all of this unfold, found himself unable to simply continue his journey as though nothing had happened. Before his repaired carriage finally departed Hallowmere, he asked to speak with the village elders in the square, the very place where the old oak tree, still split from the storm of Alira's birth, stood as a permanent reminder of the superstition that had shaped her life. With most of the village gathered to see the nobleman off, the Duke spoke clearly and firmly. He told them that he had traveled through many villages and towns in his years overseeing his family's lands, and that he had met few people, noble or common, with the knowledge, skill, and quiet strength that Alira Voss possessed. He reminded them, without anger but with clear honesty, that it was this same young woman they had whispered about and avoided, who had just spent 3 sleepless days saving their children and elders from a dangerous fever, while their trained physician had fled at the first sign of difficulty. He said that a person's worth was shown through their actions, not through old stories about storms and strange eyes, and that Hallowmere had been fortunate, more fortunate than they perhaps realized, to have someone like her among them. Then, turning to Alira herself, who stood quietly at the edge of the gathered crowd, surprised by the public nature of his words, the Duke made an offer. He told her that his household, several days' travel from Hallowmere, was in need of a skilled physician and advisor, someone capable of managing matters of health for his family and the people on his lands, with proper resources, proper respect, and a position of genuine importance. He told her she would never again have to prove her worth to people who refused to see it. Alira looked toward her grandmother, who, despite her tired eyes, gave her a small, encouraging smile and a slow nod. Old Marin had spent years protecting and teaching her granddaughter, precisely so that one day she might have the chance to live a life beyond the limits Hallowmere had tried to place on her. This, she understood, without needing to be told, was that chance. Alira accepted the Duke's offer. Within a week, after settling her grandmother into a comfortable arrangement with a trusted neighbor who would look after her, Alira left Hallowmere, the village of whispers and superstition, for a new life, where her knowledge and character would be valued rather than feared. As her carriage passed the old split oak tree on her way out of the village, she did not look back with sadness. She looked forward, toward a future finally shaped by her own extraordinary abilities, rather than the fearful stories others had once told about her birth.